Sydney was a battle-hardened cruiser that was sunk on the eve of Pearl Harbor in 1942, November 42, wasn't it? I didn't know anything about it at the time, but the son of the radio operator had written a book about the sinking of the Sydney, which he contacted me after one of the Kennedy assassination films and asked me if I'd do something about it. And so I went and meet him. And fascinating guy. And he'd written this book really stating that there was a huge amount of skullduggery involved in the cover-up to the sinking of the Sydney because of its chronological importance to the raid on Pearl Harbor by the Japanese. So it may sound a bit of a distant connection, but essentially what happened was the Sydney was sunk with all hands, the only cruiser to have ever lost all hands during the whole of the Second World War. And it was sunk supposedly by a German raider. Now, German raiders were little frigates with a couple of guns on them, designed really to sink small merchant ships. They roamed disguised, in this case disguised as a Norwegian freighter, and wouldn't be conspicuous. And then as soon as they came across a merchantman, they would drop their disguise, fire shells into the hold of this ship and sink it, or torpedoes. It wasn't a serious combatant vehicle, but it was a sneak vehicle which worked well. It was approached by the Sydney, who saw her. It was named a Kormoran. She saw the vessel. The Sydney approached her. This is the I'll give you the official account. Sydney approached her just as she was on her, close to her. The Kormoran dropped all her disguises, panels on the hull, and launched torpedoes and opened fire on the warship. And the warship exchanged fire, sunk the Kormoran instantly. And the last survivors of the Kormoran, as it went down, saw the Sydney steaming off over the horizon. Didn't notice any major fires at that time, but they were in a lifeboat. Most of the crew survived of the Kormoran, which is why it attracted my attention in the first place. How could the crew and the hostages that were on board the Kormoran survive this conflict, and a battle-hardened warship with 470 sailors on it sink without trace? There was something not quite right about that fact, but if you think about the fact it was the day before the raid on Pearl Harbor, then that brings into another side of it. You start looking at another point of view now. So correspondence between the British War Office, Churchill essentially, and Roosevelt. There was a series of telegrams about the Sydney, we presume it was about the Sydney, that are still secret. There are military secrets. We're not allowed to know about them. Now, if you look into it, the chances of a raider sinking one of the most successful cruisers of the Second World War, to dupe them into approaching close enough to be able to be vulnerable, is questionable in itself. But a couple of other facts have come to light, which is even more interesting. When they were rescued from their lifeboats, some of the crew were holding Japanese milk bottles. These were the hardened dancers, were in possession of Japanese milk bottles. They were clean-shaven, healthy, whereas the survivors in the other two lifeboats, which had been the sailors picked up by the Cormorant from the boats they'd sunk on their route. These were illiterate Asians, Indians, Pakistanis, sailors who didn't speak English, but knew that there was something fishy, because they had this these Nazis who were rude and nasty to them and pushed them away all the time. They didn't tell, they'd never seen the submarine, but what I assume is a submarine that was accompanying the invasion force that was about to bomb Pearl Harbor came across the Sydney, had to eliminate the Sydney, prevent it from notifying Pearl Harbor that there was a belligerent Japanese fleet, and so all that information was kept secret. And I still don't know. So my assumption is that that Roosevelt and Churchill, because of Bletchley Park and the fact Bletchley Park for years had been reading all the Japanese communications, would have known about that particular invasion, would have known about that impending raid, which is proved to me by the fact they got all the flat tops out, all the big ships that were sunk in Battleship Row in Pearl Harbor were mostly First World War stuff, which they wanted to get rid of anyway. They wanted to replace their fleet because it was all obsolete. But they got their flat tops out because the flat tops are the ones that could work. Every strategician had said was going to be the way that wars will be fought in the future. And it proved to be correct. So the cause and effect suggests that they did know what was going on. And the fact they've maintained secrecy on vital documents also makes it obvious to me that they did know what was going on. But it's par for the course. You know, it's Pearl Harbor, we had, before that there was the Lusitania. Since then we've had 9/11, we've had Bay of Tonkin. We've had all this stuff that proves to be very questionable, but it justifies huge military expenditure. And I don't think they're not strangers, these two incidents. They're all related. It's all, we're all cannon fodder, I think. This is what it's all about. But anyway, so the sinking of the Sydney is a fascinating program. It's a fascinating document because we've got the testimony of all the survivors describing the conflict and describing because there were no survivors from the Sydney. The only thing they found about the Sydney were machine-gunned life jackets on an island in the Pacific somewhere. They found some remnants of floats, but they'd all been machine guns. So presumably any survivors had been exterminated because they didn't want, the world was not allowed to know that the Allies knew the Japanese were en route to get America into the Second World War. And that's what it was all about, getting America into the Second World War. 9/11 was all about rearming America after Clinton had destroyed the defense force, or the neocons perceived it was destroying the defense capability. That's what 9/11 was all about. The new American century, they even wrote about it. You know, all the Cheney and the Wolfowitz, they wrote about what was going to happen. You know, they said, we've got to have a catastrophic event to galvanize the American people into spending this sort of money on arms. And what better way to have another Pearl Harbor or 9/11, whatever. Anyway, so that's the story of the Sydney is very profound because it has ramifications for the way in which that tiny clique of people operate and manipulate the rest of us. And with the press on your side, the world's your oyster. Anyway, that's a program that will get made, has to be made, and not going to be popular, but none of them will be. So that's the essence of it. This is all, we're not being manipulated by the establishment, which is what the press do. You know, we're told to believe all sorts of ridiculous bollocks, most of it is, on behalf of a tiny number of people. And it's because they own the press. You know, as I say, 6 American corporations own 95% of the media in America. And they own also half of the arms industries. And so, you know, it's not rocket science. You can see what's going on. Anyway, so the Sydney is well worth an examination and a serious documentary to look at, which we intend to do. I've written the whole thing. I know what we're going to say. So if you want to invest in that one, by all means, it's a lovely story and it'll rustle quite a few feathers.